Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Publics at IIHS. We are very happy to have Venkat Srinivasan here with us, and he's going to talk about some of the very interesting work that they're doing at the archives at NCBS. Thank you, Venkat, for taking the time out to be here. So, without wasting any further time, I'm going to ask our faculty, Nishtha Vadera, to introduce Venkat and get the session started.
It's my pleasure to introduce Venkat Srinivasan, who's a visiting researcher and archivist at the National Centre for Biological Sciences in Bangalore. Venkat's work spans the intersection of science journalism, scientific research, and history, which have led him to probe ways to build diverse science narratives from archival material. A research engineer by training, he's also an independent science writer who has been published widely across Indian and international publications like The Atlantic, Nautilus, Eon, Wired, and The Caravan. Along with institutional records, the NCBS Archives is a repository for the contemporary history of biology in India. The best part is it's free and open to public, so I definitely recommend a visit.
I got this. Thank you. Thanks so much, Nishtha, Tanvi, IIHS, all of you for coming here as well. You may have noticed she didn't say archivist, and that's true. I'm not trained as one, so please, I ask for your indulgence. A couple of standard disclaimers that I share. One, I've looked around the room. I think 3 of you have seen about half the slides. So a note on self-plagiarism. I really have nothing new to say, but I hope some of this is new to this audience here. 2, I speak on behalf of about 45 people who have been involved in the setting up of the archives. And one of them is sitting in the back, and he's the one who chose this image, and I'm sure he doesn't like to be recognized, but there you go. Okay, just. I call this talk Archives as Crucible, Archives as Commons, and there's a larger sort of structure that I'm trying to develop around these ideas of, the archives as a metaphor. And feel free to stop at any point, and if I can just request, when I have 10 Is this, this is probably much better. Yeah, thanks. Okay, I'll start with a story. You're looking at an archival object. You're looking at an object that wasn't necessarily archival 3 years ago, not even 2 years ago, but it's an object nonetheless. It has an ID, as most archival objects do, and that ID is MS0051111. Archives at NCBS, so if you choose to ever use it, if you come to the archives, this is how you would cite it so that others can find it. This is generally what you have. And so we said, we're interested in field notes, photographs, correspondence, what is it that you have? And so Ajit's literally sort of turned around at his desk and, pulled this out and said, do you want this? So in the early days, as it is today, we said yes first and then figure out what it is later. And so we said, yes, we would love to have it. And we asked him what it was. And he said, I was studying the population of tree-living mammals in the Annamalai Hills in South India in the early 80s. And I was just sort of nodding my head. I'm not an ecologist by training, not even a biologist by training, as Nishtha might have pointed out. And so I was just sort of capturing these ideas, and I said, okay, fine, let's keep this. And so he started talking about what these are. The months of the year are given on the top. Some of you may notice that August is not there. It's something that I noticed only a year after this, because I wasn't really critically reading it. And this is something that I'll talk about, the idea of archives as critical reading. The acronyms on the left are mammals. But honestly, if you look at it carefully, and I wish the lights were slightly dimmer, but because you might see some perforations on this little paper, I don't know if you see the perforations. Maybe it's a little clearer now. And these perforations have a certain pattern. And if you're thinking, yes, you're right, it's Braille. And so our question to Ajit at that point was, Ajit, why are you writing on Braille paper? It's the one thing you perhaps don't do with Braille. So what's going on? And Ajit is this sort of nonchalant scientist, and he says, well, I was a starving graduate student. Paper was good, non-blotting paper was hard to find. This is the early 80s. Turns out a friend of his who was on the field site happened to be blind and perhaps was devout because he had a copy of the Bible in Braille. And so Ajit asked him, well, where do you get the Bible? And so Ajit's friend said, well, a church in the United States sent it over to me. And Ajit and his friends, desperate for good non-blotting paper, said, what happens if we do the same? And sure enough, they did the same. And the church, perhaps thrilled that there was this little colony of people in the Annamalai Hills, sent many, many copies of the Bible in Braille. And once they sent it, they did not stop. And so Ajit and his colleagues happily used it for shelf lining, for field notes, for covering things. And of course, one of them used it to read the Word of God. So I mean no disrespect here, of course, to the church. I've been saying that, I think they really should be giving me a commission because I've been evangelizing them in ways that they probably wouldn't have had in the past. And Ajit is really a rock star in the archival circles. Most people in the archiving community that I've spoken to really sort of revere this story of Ajit because it sort of gets at the heart of what an archive tries to do, which is meaning making. Because what you see now is that it's no longer just the story of the population of tree-living mammals, which of course is the main layer, but there are these under layers of the story of theology, the story of evangelism, the story of non-blotting paper, if you're interested in it, as I am as a material scientist. And of course, there is a story of resourcefulness in the sciences. What do you do? What does it take to get to do science? The process, which is what an archive always tries to capture, the process and the context, right? So I just want to leave these ideas with you. Which is to also bring around this point that, when you're in the middle of a story, I use Atwood again because Atwood is in vogue, but also because this is a particularly sort of telling statement that she has made in her book, Alias Grace, where she says when you're in the middle of a story, it's not a story at all, it's really a roaring blindness, some sort of, you're not really sure what's going to happen. It only becomes a story when you start sharing it with someone else. The way I'm starting to share these stories with you about the archives, right? There's a narrative that we're trying to build here. And this is another word I'll keep coming back to, the archives as narrative. There's a little framework that we use when we think about stories in the archive or archival documents. It's a very simple framework, but it's sort of really helped us quite a bit. Going back to this Braille document, every story has many people. The story of the tree-living mammals is not just the story of Ajit, it's also the story of the technician, the driver, the cook, the field scientist, the engineer, all these other people who are involved in this endeavor that we call science. Ajit himself is not just a scientist, he's also someone who's very strongly thinking about the political sort of connections between ecology, politics, business of ecology, these kind of questions, right? And of course, the Bible document, as we have now seen, is a record that has many interpretations. One, perhaps you can think of as being a primary, and the other secondary, tertiary. And of course, primary, secondary, tertiary always have points of view, right? And so this is something that we try and emphasize in the idea of the archive. Whose archive is it anyway, right? So if you take nothing else away from this conversation, I hope you just remember these two things that we try and emphasize as the philosophy of the archives. That is, for us, the purpose of an archive is to enable a diversity of stories. We come back to the statement over and over again. I mentioned this in my abstract, and I sound like a broken record, but it has really, really been very, very useful for us in the way we think about the life of an archival record. We're always asking ourselves, is what I'm doing enabling a diversity of stories? This has been useful for us when we source material, when we appraise it. Appraising is making our judgment about what enters the archive, which is a very strong political act. In terms of how we think about arrangement of material, how we preserve it, how we make it accessible, how do we make it visible, right? And the other thing to just keep in mind for us is that for us, the process of archiving is a process of eliminating context and process. Someone earlier today was asking me the difference between libraries, archives, museums, and galleries, and I think the fundamental way in which an archive distinguishes itself is this focus on context and process. Glibly, sometimes I say the archives can be thought of as a repository of unpublished knowledge, or material that's original or unique, but that's more talking about form. Intent is context and process. Yeah. This is my tip of the iceberg. So I come from a background in the sciences, so I'll keep coming back to this. This is the world that I know a little bit, material science, and now increasingly a little bit of biology. My interest in the archiving world was sort of starting out by working in the sciences and realizing that the papers that we published sort of, very, very rarely really talked about the method in a broader sense of the word method. There's, of course, the section called methodology in a paper, but that doesn't really capture the social, economic circumstance, the cultural circumstance. And so the way I see it, the archive is really about that. The archive sort of captures the rest of the iceberg, whereas the published material that goes on PubMed or whatever it is really the tip of the iceberg, right? Sorry for the horrible representation here, by the way. In effect, it's going back to the statement that I said again before, context, process. How did, and as I said here, how did it come about that person A studied topic B in year C in location D? This is not something that was going to go in the paper, right? So a few slides, just to give you an overview. I have to plug the archive. It's free and open to the public, as we said. We have a divan, come sleep. We actually have a room where nobody can find you, so please come do that. It's a public collecting archive for the history of contemporary biology in India. These three words have meaning. Contemporary for us is 200 years. India is broadly South Asia as a sort of a spatial boundary that we have to apply. And by biology, we are fairly broad about how we think about it, the politics of biology, the culture of biology. And honestly, if we find something interesting, we'll find a way to see the biology in it. That's how we've generally approached it. And of course, there's biology in everything. Just a few quick slides. Just a look at the website for the archives. You can look it up. It should, if it's never loaded on your phones before, it'll take a little while, but once it's cached, it's a little faster. We're working on it. We have about 50,000 objects. I'll tell you a little bit about what objects mean here. Early 20th century to current, most of our materials from the 1970s, 80s. The largest two sort of, most interesting papers in my point of view are the Siddiqui papers and the Sankaran papers. These are things that we've looked at, very, very different kinds of stories that are embedded in them. The Sankaran papers are an example of our first external collection. It's an example of someone from the public coming and reaching out to us and saying, would you like to keep these documents? So just a quick look. This is all available for you from wherever you're sitting. So the catalog is freely available, so you can have a look at the entire catalog. And we follow archival sort of methods fairly rigorously. And we take forever to archive things. So, but that's okay because we don't have an awful lot to begin with. Just a quick example of a search that you would do on the catalog and things like that. And I'm just going to walk through some images of the archive. But please do come visit. We're not that very far. We're about 25 minutes from here. So if you can escape the Hebbal traffic, then we are smooth sailing after that. So just some images. This is the reading room. That's the divan I told you about. I did not lie. This is the answer. There's the reception. So just going to walk through some slides here. Okay. So I'm going to cover this talk over about sort of 5 sections. And the first section is basically going to be talking about archives and the idea of time. That I think it's useful for us to constantly ask ourselves these questions. Where does the archive begin? Where does the story begin? Where does the archive reside? Where does the story reside? Where does the archive end? Where does the story end? Okay. And the other thing I'm going to look at is archives from the perspective of space, which is to ask ourselves, whose material enters the archive? Who's archiving it? Who interprets it? When does curation become the archive? And for whom does the archive really exist? I mean, these are questions that I think we need to ask ourselves in the contemporary, because the idea of an archive historically has been very different, the idea of the capital A archive. And I'll talk about those as we go forward. So archives in time, archives in space, and I'll talk about the other archives metaphors that I just spoke to you about. So, time. Just give me a second. So, when we started the archive, when we opened in February this year. We're not very old, and we started to think a little bit about what is the word archive in multiple Indian languages, and it turned out it wasn't an easy problem to solve. We took forever with this little thing, and there are probably some mistakes. So if you guys find mistakes, please tell us. Sort of major Indian languages. But the point I'm trying to make here is that when you start looking at the origin of the word archive and see how it is interpreted in various Indian languages, so it connotates, it has different meaning in different languages. So in Hindi, it's a space for letters, roughly. In Tamil, it's a home for documents, not necessarily old. Okay. In Urdu, it's Muhafiz Khana. It's like space of precious material in some form. And you probably the others language that you can see. And the word archive, of course, comes from sort of French, then Latin, and I think I have that structure here. So French, which got it from the Latin, got it from Greek, and comes from the idea of the archons. These sort of magistrates, the home of the archons is where the word comes from, arche. And Derrida has talked about this endlessly in his 1994 paper. The people in the archival world have sort of, thought about this, particular archive fever article to death. Some of you in the audience perhaps are more familiar with this paper than I am. But Derrida talks about this idea of the archive coming from arche, which means both commandment and commencement. So this idea that the word captures both the idea of a beginning and an idea of power and archival structures and sort of power hierarchical structures. Hence all these words. I love etymology, so I just love to sort of look at these things. So, but I think it's useful to sort of take a step back and ask, is this really true? That, is the archive an idea of commencement? In the practical day-to-day way, and I'd like to argue that perhaps not. That it's perhaps useful to think of the archive, as Margaret Atwood did, as being something in the middle of a story, that it's always in the middle of a story. And it's something that I want to sort of keep coming back to. Lev Manovich, in the early days of the internet, when these ideas of digital databases started to sort of become really popular, started to ask this question, what is the relationship between the database and the narrative? And he made the statement in his paper that the database and the narrative are natural enemies. And it's not something that, again, I find myself agreeing with. And I think I'd like to think of the database and the narrative as being co-conspirators, as things that cannot exist without the other. And I'll talk a little bit about this in a heuristic that I will set up about, again, thinking about the archive as being in the middle of a story. That if you don't make them as opposites, or if you make them as feeding on each other, I think that lends for a more forgiving definition of the word archive and what it means in the contemporary. So, if I sort of take this interface that, Manovich, and I don't mean to sort of, Lev Manovich was just responding to the idea of the database in the late 90s. So this is just a 20-year sort of evolution looking back at it. There's an interspace between the archive and the narrative, and there's an interpretation that leads from one to the other. Right? This might be the structure that Lev Manovich is talking about. But I think the actual heuristic is a little more complicated, and I think it's something like this, right? That the archive is somewhere in this messy thing that we call the story. And it always, always, always has to come from a story. Every archival object is a product of various narratives that converge onto things that we call objects, some of which get appraised and enter the capital A archive, which then get interpreted, which then become other newer narratives, which lend to other memories or triggers that we think of, which then eventually led to maybe, say, oral history interviews, which become objects, some of which become archival objects. You get the idea. I'm stating a truism here, but it's useful to just sort of position ourselves in this sort of a framework, I think. Has anyone read Humboldt's biography by Andrea Wolfe? Yeah. So, an extraordinary little text, not a little text, it's quite a tome, but an example of just archival research, in my opinion, at its finest. But what's going on in that book is there's a particular moment, and correct me if I'm wrong, when she talks about Alexander von Humboldt, who is invited by Thomas Jefferson to the United States to talk about what's going on in this Spanish colony just south of the United States. This is in the late 18th century, I think so. Now, Jefferson, the president, calls Humboldt because he doesn't have access to information from the Spanish colony. They're not as willing to share this knowledge with the United States. But Humboldt, who's this German or, I guess, Prussian emissary, happens to have access to the Spanish colony and happens to have access to the archives there and has dug into those details. Humboldt is this polymath naturalist, just amazing sort of, just getting interested in, soaked into these ideas. And so Humboldt has this knowledge about what's going on historically, and then he's invited by Jefferson, and Jefferson gets the lowdown on what's going on down south. And we know all this through Andrea Wolfe's biography of Humboldt in the year 2014. And if you deconstruct what's going on, it's effectively, Andrea Wolfe has visited the Library of Congress archives, looked at material there, the capital A archive, material there from a narrative which Jefferson and Humboldt had, where they have a narrative from Humboldt's experience at the archives in, what is now called Mexico. It's like the movie Inception, if that makes sense. It's like you're constantly going into this world, and somewhere in this, in the year 2050, there will be an annotated version of Andrea Wolfe's biography in some archive, right? And so then someone will derive meaning from that, right? So that's the framework that I just want to leave in your minds. So I got some, sort of backing from Catalan Steedman, whose work I came across recently, where she says archives hold no origins, they always hold everything in medias res. And I sort of, strongly resonate with this idea. I also like what she said here, which is that it's useful to remember the archive is never complete. So as a historian, she says your craft is to conjure a social system from a nutmeg grater. I mean, this image is just stuck in my head. I'm imagining someone with a nutmeg grater trying to construct a social system from it. And I just find this sort of framework useful, but I think it's useful, very, very useful to remember the archive is never complete. So you're always going to derive some meaning, not exhaustive. So what does an archive look like? We know the traditional A archive, of course. We know the brick and mortar structures, we know compactors, we know folders, files. That is largely the structure of the archive at NCBS. But there are various other forms of the archive word, right? All of you have an archive of some sort, and we'll talk about that in a moment. I'll take an example from the contemporary. This is a news fact from the New York Times a couple of months ago, where they talked about this little amazing factoid: 420,000 closed-circuit television cameras in the city of London. About one for every 50 people? No, what was it? Yeah, 48 cameras for 1,000 people. More than any city except Beijing. Okay. My question is, in the year 2100, what from this is going to be in an archive? Is it going to be the New York Times article? Will it be an example of a closed-circuit surveillance camera from the year 2019? Will it be the purchase order? Will it be the memo that says we need more surveillance? Will it be the 365 24/7 footage? Probably not that, right? But my point is, there are various things here. Some of them will enter an archive, some of them will not, and then someone will construct a narrative looking at the history of surveillance from the year 2019. So it's useful for us to remember that this narrative that you have here will explode into many, many different objects. Some of them may enter an archive, and we're going to construct a narrative from it in the future. So I use this example basically to also say that all of us, when we document stuff on our phones, this 365 24/7 footage, this constant documenting that we are doing. We say that we're in this age of hyper documentation, is a word I heard last week, which is fine. I mean, historically, we don't know what we were documenting. I mean, the point is, we document a lot, we observe perhaps little, and we curate even less. And I think this idea of curation is very, very important for us to understand, because curation is at the heart of an archive. That the curation step in many ways precedes the archive. We don't have a choice about this. The Siddiqui papers at NCBS are just a reflection of Siddiqui's curation over the course of his life, right? So what will remain from this is just, whatever the zeitgeist thought was important. And we just have to live with that. So there are various forms of the word archive, right? The archives as verb, you're always archiving your emails. You put them on Dropbox, Slack, or what I love to call as WhatsApp University. There is, of course, archives as justice, which is the People's Archive of Rural India. There is archives as scholarship or digital humanities, which is a word that is floating around quite a bit. So the Kabir archives, the Shakespeare archives, the Gandhi Serve. I mean, these are examples of what I would think of archives as scholarship, where the people are coming at it with a specific sort of research question in mind and collecting material around it. And of course, archives as Burning Man, which is, we have at this point tools like Snapchat, which, by definition are deciding not to keep the material. So if all of us decided to use Snapchat today, in the year 2100, we will just have to reflect that in the year 2019, we used modes of communication that we decided to sort of make disappear as soon as we sort of sent the information out. As an archivist, once you take a long-range view of history, everything starts to be like, fine, this is just how the human species operated in the year 2019. There are archives like this, There are archives like this work by Sivaji Nathan, which I read about a month ago. I'm not sure when I read this. Which is looking at, if I remember right, it's an archive of the people the disappeared people history from Kashmir. And so this is an example of an archive that's filling a gap, because this is never ever going to make its way into the traditional A archive, right? So every archive, in a sense, is what, as Derrida said, acts as a memorial and a reminder. There's a way of saying, we matter. And so the question again to ask, going back to that previous slide is, whose archive is it? Who's archiving it? Who is it for? And there's this constant effort to say, we matter, this matters, I matter, right? And that's in effect what an archive, all these different forms of archive are trying to do, right? Even your email records, the ones that you decide to keep. So it's useful, I think, especially the slide that I shared with you previously, because the traditional A archive is not going to keep everything. The traditional A archive very much responds to the idea of Derrida's commandment, the idea of hierarchy, the idea of power structures. And so, and it's useful to remember that, because as I'm sure some of you would have gone to Rangashankara in the last, when they had their theatre festival, where this was also quoted, the Book of Laughter and Forgetting, where they talked about The first step in liquidating a people is to erase its memory, destroy its books. The world will soon forget it even faster. And he says this very nicely. Is it true that a nation cannot cross a desert of organized forgetting? Archives are centers of power, right? The traditional A archive, of course, and hence you have an emergency archive, a partition archive, not one, 3 partition archives, right? Hence you have the disappeared people's archive. Hence you have so many different archives, the Aboriginal community archives. These are responses to saying, I matter, I shall exist, despite what the state decides to think of as being important. This is just an example of what they've done in South Africa as sort of a broader sort of reconciliation effort. This is the Apartheid Archives project. It's very interesting because they have sort of been very deliberate in the way they have structured the archive. They have removed specific names. They have just wanted to capture the histories. So you look at these histories, you know, it'll say female African 30s, academic administrator. So you're sort of profiling without actually divulging who it is. The intent is to capture the story without, you know, implicating the individual, right? We could do something like this in various parts. Okay, so the third part of what I'm going to talk about is these 3 sort of, you know, directions in which I'm going to sort of focus this talk. Archives as innovation, archives as commons, and archives as crucible. There are, of course, I mean, there is the primary job of an archive, which is archives as record, which is committing to heart, going back to Latin again. And archives as justice, which I think is something that will fold into the idea of archives as commons. Okay, so first, looking at archives as innovation. I'm going to focus only on the efforts that we're doing at the archives at NCBS, but I think these ideas can be applicable in a broader sense. As I said, we opened the archive earlier this year, and we have a template out there for what a physical archive in a digital narrative space. But our effort constantly here is to think of the archive as I said, enabling diverse stories. We have a stories section where we've tried to sort of address this idea, which we call 13 Ways, based on Wallace Stevens's poem, 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. A lovely poem. If you haven't read it, please go check it out. Simply a way to say, you know, can we go beyond the linear narrative for an institution and just find multiple ways of slicing an institution's history? So, you know, we have a slice from the perspective of time, just open source tools like this Night Lab tool, just looking at what happened after what. This is the simplest way to look at history, I suppose. Looking at it from the perspective of space. So we have spaces within the campus on which we've sort of embedded these archival documents, and we're sort of basically what I would call a Google Street View with history. So we're just walking around the spaces and we're trying to get a sense of, you know, people's memories around those spaces. We have this, which is, you know, archives as connects. So, you know, PeoplePlex is a way in which every single node that you see here is an excerpt from an oral history interview, and we've just made connections to show what person is connected to what story. So is there a way to connect, say, the interview of a fly lab technician, a technician who grows yeast for fruit flies, to, say, a paper from the 1960s, which talked about the use of Drosophila fruit flies for neurogenetics? Can we make meaningful connections between someone's personal narrative of why they moved from Harvard to a paper from Caltech on why they should use fruit flies for neurobiology? Now, we can do this. You know, as writers, we are always doing this. We are meaning making. We just wanted to make some tools that can make this more explicit for people younger in, say, 11th or 12th grade to do this. And this is sort of a more common structure. You know, we were constantly slicing the histories of the institution around different narratives. So please have a look at it. These are just some tools that we're trying to build as open source tools. Going forward, I kept saying, you know, whose archive is it, who's interpreting it? This is something that also that we're developing in the coming year, if we get money. But it's broadly a very, very simple idea. It's simply to say that, you know, if all of us were to go to the same museum and stare at the same painting, we would likely have very different interpretations of this painting, because we have our own experiences. If we strip the caption away, right? If we are not led by the caption, we're going to have our different interpretations of the object. So we say, why shouldn't the archival object have the same sort of strength? Why can't we all look at the object, add our own interpretations to it, and let those interpretations feed back to the archival sort of repository as a layer of discovery for the next person? You know, you see brushstrokes, I see Civil War histories. You see blue, I see a particular kind of calligraphy. Let's have those interpretations coexist with the archive's way of looking at things. So this is the archives as interpretation sort of module. So this is a tool that we're just calling Spacere, which is just a dynamic annotation tool. It's also to say that we not all annotations have the same sort of strength. A story might be primarily about astronomy, but it might also be about something else. This story is primarily about stem cell use at NCBS, but it's also a little bit about the use of fertility clinics in Bombay in the late 90s as a source for stem cell lines. As it were, I spoke to an anthropologist last week, and she mentioned that she is working on fertility clinics. And so this is great, right? So this is an example of where we can at least have material for an anthropologist if we were able to tag it in a certain nuanced, meaningful way. So phase 3 for us is to sort of build out storytelling tools for the public, because again and again, I'll come back to the idea that without having spaces to tell stories, the archive is largely meaningless. So the archive exists to enable these stories. Otherwise, what's the point of keeping them? And by the word story, I mean something very, very broad. It could be a policy, it could be a narrative, it could be an installation, it could be a play. We had a play in March using material from the archives. We had a poet come recently. So we have no idea how people will use it. And the archive has something for everyone. So please come. It's a very simple idea. It's simply to say that you walk into this archival sort of consortium, you look at objects in the archive, you see what you want, you put it into your storytelling shopping cart, and then we have sort of a dashboard that leads you in building these sort of spaces out. It's relatively simple to do. The difficulty is really in sort of the administrative details of how we do this. Looks like a very complicated sort of flowchart, but I'll try and break this down. What we're trying to work towards in the coming 2 or 3 years is to really build a consortium of archives whose material speaks to each other. Right? Not just in the sciences, but across different disciplines, wherein you have all these archives sort of exporting their material to a common space, which is sort of a catalog of catalogs, which is what we would call a layer of discovery, so that you're able to walk into the space and see connections from different spaces. A layer of interpretation, so that you're able to annotate them for the next person to come along, and a layer of narration for high school or early sort of college students to derive narratives from it, so that people realize what kind of stories they can be embedded in. Yeah. And we're hoping this is a network that should just keep growing over a period of time. We're hoping that this process will be a way in which places that don't have archives will feel that they too should have one, so that they can be part of this ecosystem. It's not difficult. It requires a bunch of people to say yes. I'm not kidding, really. This is not new stuff. Case in point. The ideas have been around since the ideas of the card catalog. I mean, it's been around since, I think the card catalog was a beautiful, elegant way in library sciences approached data management, and we've kind of lost that way of thinking about things. This is a little graph from the early days of the internet about thinking about relationships between documents. This is Ted Nelson's work on the hypertext in the 1960s. And this is an email from Mark Anderson in 1993 talking about how to use annotation on web browsers. And of course, there are web annotation tools these days, but talking about something from a couple of decades ago almost. So, what am I doing here? I come back to this article by Marilyn Robinson, where she sort of expressed caution about these use of tools, digital tools in the humanities. This is becoming like a buzzword that you just use. And so I want to sort of clarify that our intent here is not to build tools. Tools are a means to a larger end, and the end here is really to try and build spaces for critical thinking around the archival object, letting people have layers of meaning and imbuing those layers of meaning on the objects. Adobe Flash will go away, right? Hypothesis may not exist. Web annotation tools may not exist. The idea of the internet may change in 50 years. But the idea of just being able to see ways of seeing, as John Berger describes, is something that I hope we can just sort of keep applying and find ways to look at that. So we tried doing this with, this was fun. So we took 4 sort of archival objects, we put them on a table. We took clotheslines, and we just spun yarn around them, and we gave people little cards, and their intent, they had to look at the objects without the captions and annotate them. And then we had other people around who would just sort of upvote and downvote like it was Reddit. We had people sort of, look at the annotations and derive meaning from it by showing narratives that are in this space here, what kind of narratives are triggered by the annotations. And we had a space here for what kind of memories are triggered by these narratives. It was good fun. We were just doing this at a conference just to see how people relate to the idea of the internet played out in a physical space. So this gave us sort of some confidence that we can try and test these ideas out, because tools will come and go, but this at least forces students in particular to sort of look at the object and not be led by assumptions around the captions or how the archive sees it. Okay, archives as commons. I'm super passionate about this idea of archives as commons because I think growing up, I don't know, show of hands, how many of you have ever visited an archive when you were growing up? I shouldn't raise my hand, I didn't. Good, that's what I expected. How many of you visited libraries? Yeah, museums, art gallery, exhibitions. Yeah, so this, I think, is a problem. I mean, historically, the archives have been an elite space. They've always been a space for the historian at best. You know, maybe the occasional journalist who would walk through those spaces. Increasingly in India, of course, it's used primarily in Bangalore in particular. It's used by real estate speculators. And for RTI queries, the archivists, you know, are really burdened at the Karnataka State Archives, Kailas, but they really love it when someone comes with a research question, because I mean, it's like, you know, research, really? So, but I want to get back to what Terry Cook said in this article. He said the archive is a foreign country to many historians, right? So I'm thinking, you know, if an archive is a foreign country to historians, what is it for the rest of us, right? And it's an also important point to raise here that, you know, archivists are always co-creating the archive. It's an understated point that, you know, you're always making decisions on what to keep and what to erase. The primary job of an archivist is erasure, not keeping something. This is something a French archivist told me once, and it sort of struck me how true that was. Most of the time we're deciding what not to keep, right? And this has repercussions going forward for many, many generations. So if that's the case, then it's useful to ask, you know, who's the archive for? Who's making the archive? Who's describing it? These questions that I keep asking. So unless we think of the archives as part of the urban commons, unless we're all part of this, unless we sort of go into the archives in the city and say, you know, whose histories are we keeping here? Whose histories are being forgotten? What kind of alternate archives can we make? We're never going to get to a point where the archive can be somewhat representative of the zeitgeist. So in a very, very small way, our attempt is to think of the archive at NCBS as a space that connects these four worlds. The scientist to the academic who's not in the sciences, the public with other kinds of storytellers like poets, playwrights, artists, as we've had in the past 1 year or so, and sort of really think of it as a commons for these people, and then going forward, maybe others. Unfortunately, the campus at NCBS is ridiculously sort of high security. I have no idea why. But once you get past the security, it's open to the public. We're working on it. So this is a lovely illustration that was done by a student named Vaishnavi who worked with us. And so she made this little map of, you know, how she thought of as the archive. And so we think of the archive as free co-working space without coffee. We don't allow coffee. We have a rotating gallery space. We have a monthly public lecture series. Please come for that. Can I plug it? I guess I can plug it, right? Next Friday, please come. And it's a place for just having discussions. You know, we've had discussions on whether we should vote. Really, yeah, actually, we had a 19-year-old say that we shouldn't vote. So that happened earlier this year. So it was a good conversation. I don't think he voted eventually. But anyway, and we have a small pop-up exhibition space for younger artists. So we had our first student artist have a solo exhibition in the archives. So we're trying to just work with different communities constantly, just to see what will click. Howard Zinn in the 1977 said something a little more strong. You know, he said the archivist, in subtle ways, tends to perpetuate the political and economic status simply by going about his or her ordinary business. This is very, very true. This article is an extraordinary article. I really encourage all of you to go read it, because I think this has deep repercussions around how we think about the past, how we memorialize it, how we capture the moment to say, this happened, I matter. These are very, very important questions to ask. So I'll wrap up with a couple of conversations now around the archives as crucible, as what I think as the way forward. There are images of archives around the world as being spaces for, you know, dusty spaces for people above 80 years old, which is perhaps true in some cases, and we'd like to change that impression of the archive. The archive should not be dusty, but it really has to be imagined and challenged by people who are, you know, in their 20s, in their teens, in their 30s. Because without that happening, these are the people who are custodians of these spaces that we're making right now. I mean, the archive is not for us today. The archive is for someone 2 generations ahead of us. And if that's the case, they have to be involved in the decision making. And so we took a chance, and there was a student who reached out to us in August 2017 saying, can I work? And so we just said, okay, fine, what's the worst that could happen? And that was brilliant. She was just absolutely brilliant. And so that was the spark for us to have students. I mean, so we just put out an open call just to see what will happen. I think it's worked, but honestly, we've learned more from the students than I think they have learned from us. We've had students from about 15 different disciplines, about 45, 44 students, and this is something that we've been trying to do. I just want to put out a shout out to all the people who've been involved, but we're trying to build curriculum using the archive going forward. We're trying to work with schools and colleges to think of the archive as a space where they can practice their craft. So we had a law student who worked on an essay on digital copyright and intellectual property. We had a student of architecture work on how to imagine the physical space of the archive. So we were a client for her in that sense. We have a student right now, a recent PhD graduate who's working on developing a board game for 8th and 9th class students, using the archive as the base, and ideas around conservation, thinking about how to think about conservation at that age. People can have whatever background they have, it doesn't matter to us. Our intent here is not to train people to become archivists, although we can do that as well. Our intent here simply is to make sure that people have some historical context as they go forward, some attempt for us to have a space to think independently, think critically, do the meaning making, see the layers, going back to the John Berger ways of seeing sort of framework. And we've really benefited from the questions that people have asked us, because that every one of us here in this list, I'm beginning to realize, is not trained as an archivist. We've gone at it asking all the stupid questions. We've read all the same papers, and we've kind of benefited from that process. So I do encourage people to come and sort of just reach out to us in whatever way you think is useful for you. If you're an institute and you want to develop curriculum using the archives, please come. Let's collaborate on some ideas around this. So just a shout out again to all the institutions that have sort of given us a hand on this. And how much do I have? A few more minutes? Yeah, okay. I'm just going to wrap up with another little story. So, can I? Yeah, it works. So, this was actually a student who was working with us sort of found this little document out, and he came and he said, have you seen this? And I hadn't. Just extraordinary how things happen, right? In spite of everything. So this is a letter that Ubaid Siddiqui received, and this was how it came. It somehow landed at his desk, right? It says, Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, Bombay, India, right? Someone wrote Kolaba later, right? Okay, and they were sure to make sure they had their entire address on the back though, right? It's like, you better know where it came from. Came from Baghdad, Iraq, right? Came in the year 2000, I think I'll just see in the next slide. So Hanan Ali Chacha, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his or her name, I don't know actually, was in the Department of Mathematics and wrote this lovely letter to Ubaid in the year 2000, not too long ago, 19 years ago, saying, I'm an MSc student and my thesis in the field functional analysis, can't read it very well, and applications of something to the Leslie matrix. I'll be grateful if you send me your papers, blah, blah, blah. Ubaid is not a mathematician, okay? And so I don't know if you can read this. So Ubaid responds and says, dear Mr. Chachan, so by the way, the dates are important. May 2000, the letter was sent in March 2000. I don't even know how this reached him or how Ubaid remembered a few months later to respond. We don't have any sense of that. But he responds and says, I have left Bombay. So, the letter somehow traveled from Bombay to Bangalore, where Ubaid had moved again, and says, I am, and then he makes a typo here. He says, I'm not a biologist. I think he meant I am a biologist. And I suggest that you reach out to this other person, MS Raghunath. He's like, giving just very, very big names. Why don't you just go reach out to the biggest name in the field? Maybe that'll work. But Ubaid was a big name in the field himself. I'm just sharing this with you to just take a moment back to ask, how did this even land in the archives at NCBS, right? I mean, think about the number of ways in which it could not have landed. And I'm reminded of Simroska's poem, and I want to sort of just leave you with this idea that this world, whatever we might think of this measureless theater to which we've got reserved tickets, but tickets whose lifespan is laughably short, bounded by 2 arbitrary dates, whatever else we might think of this world, it is astonishing. This letter made it, and it's sitting in the archives for someone to use in the future. So thank you so much for your time. I guess I had one more slide, but we'll use that one.
Thank you. Any questions?
But yeah, we can talk about this as well if you'd like.
Yeah.
Should I just go through the rest of the slides? Yeah, looks like you want to see it, no? is the response to that. Can also take questions. I'm part of this. Sorry, it's a public mailing list. You can jump on this mailing list. I've just hidden the names because you do need to subscribe to it. I didn't want to do that without their consent. Yeah, this happens, right? You got to. What just stunned me honestly was that this individual, in the heat of all this, is thinking about this, right? And that there's someone out there who's responding, right? So anyway, and not just someone, like someone from the Museum of Modern Art. So I guess, yeah, the conversation is still going on, by the way. So anyway.
Yeah, Venkat, thanks for the lovely lecture. No, it's just a thought. What happens is, I myself have been involved in setting up an archive, but it's in a different context. I set up a classified archives. I was a naval historian in my previous job, and our job was to collect naval battle reports and and classified reports from various quarters. So my question is, to use very pointed, that in hindsight, when I had finished I took about three and a half years to do that while I was in Delhi. So in hindsight, I thought a lot of the narratives, or again, we had a very thin sieve through which to get the material, and although we had a lot of people telling us that you should do this, you should do that, this is how you should go about it. There was one technology part and other was the human part. Because human being, we always come with our own biases, we come with our own thought processes. My question to you is that, again, the archive, whatever the story that you've told us, it has a great deal of elitist ring to it, because let's face it, that people who go beyond a certain level of education, a certain level of intellectual accomplishment, a certain level of social and economic capital, they are the ones who would actually think about these things deeply and ruminate about this, and then further flush these things out. But again, there is a large section of the society which gets out. I mean, the subaltern section, and a subaltern is just one part, but a large part of the society which gets left out in telling its stories, or in telling its narrative. I don't know whether you would be able to, whether this question is directed to you, you're the right person to answer it or not, but since I found this lecture to be really, really very perceptive and very intuitive, I thought that I should share my kind of thoughts with you.
Oh, thanks for the question. So there was a slide that I had shared earlier. It gets at the heart. You're right. There is definitely a hierarchy even within the archives at NCBS. In the small little space that we have there, we have made decisions that are very hierarchical. Right? I'm a product of privilege, and that privilege has also been exercised through, and we're very conscious of this. There are communities that are trying to set up their own archives. There are communities in Nilgiris. I know of a good friend of mine who's setting up their archives there. But I think a question to ask, you're right, yeah. And I can connect you to the person. No. So go back to Derrida's look at the archive, right? So the archive has always situated itself within power structures. The archive has historically, the word archive, before we started to use it for our emails, has been this question of the citizen-state relationship. And it has always been this idea of record keeping from that perspective. It has been thought of as a tool for governance. Historically, it has been used as a tool for control. So now, if a community wishes to build an archive, I think it's useful to ask who is it for anyway. So it's very common to have people from the outside going to a community and building their archive, right? And then perhaps it's useful to take a step back and say, fine, that's a well-intentioned sort of thing to do, but who is this archive for? Right? So I'm not answering your question directly, but I do sort of want to point out, in any project, if we constantly ask ourselves these questions, who's it for, who's driving it, who's describing it, and who will it be used by going forward, I think that set of questions will at least get at the problem that you're raising. Some of the people whose material we have archived at NCBS would not traditionally enter an archive. We're very conscious of perhaps selecting them right now. The process of archive is sorry, I'm not articulating myself very well. There is an aspect of collection, there's an aspect of curation that is going on, perhaps almost an overcompensating that's going on, but hoping that over a period of time this will modulate and drive the archive in a certain direction. So for instance, we have about 75 oral history interviews that we have in the archive right now. The vast majority of these interviews are interviews of scientists, but there are a few who are engineers, there are a few who are technicians, there are a few who are part of the gardening community, the cooking community, the janitorial community, but they are not represented at the same level in terms of numbers as the scientists. So these are very small attempts to try and have a broader representation, but by no means are we at a point where we can say this is an egalitarian archive. I think we will get to that point when the community maintains its own archive. And by the word community at NCBS, I mean the NCBS system, or if it is a community of a particular ethnicity or whatever it is, who are maintaining their own space, and outsiders, an anthropologist just happens to go and work in that space rather than the anthropologist going and building their archive. Sorry, long answer, probably wishy-washy.
Hi, Venkat. So, some of the instances of other archives that you referred to, be it the apartheid archives, the partition archives, they had a thematic focus. You described your scope as well with the contemporary biological Indian, which is still a very broad sieve in some senses. So, I just want to get your sense on whether that posits a challenge for you, or are there advantages to it, disadvantages to it, to have such a broad sieve? Or would you rather have a more specific thematic focus for these archives?
Right. It's a question that we're grappling with right now. We are able to have a broad sieve because we're a largely empty archive. 20% is our current occupancy, so we are fairly open with what we want to, and we just want to throw the door open to see what comes through. That was one of the intentions for this very broad contemporary biology India focus. Historically, when I first moved to NCBS, they had thought of setting up an institutional archive. We decided to broaden it because we started to get queries, like the Sankaran papers. And we said, if we can build a space for the public, then we'll start to get donations. So by no means, am I stretching the, am I stating that the archive at NCBS is the only repository? There should be hundreds of contemporary biology archives in this country. This country is too large. Right? We can just think of ourselves as being a nodal center of sorts for the public. So I think a broad thematic sort of focus, you need to have some boundaries. An archive without boundaries is a very difficult archive to maintain. You need to have some direction in which you will look for material when you're twiddling your thumbs. Right? People will keep coming with material and we'll find a way to couch it. A gentleman came to us a few months ago saying, he has a stamp collection. He's a philatelist, I suppose, and so we were interested. We were just curious to know what it is, but he happened to have a focus around ecology in the 70s. That's what he was interested in. So we said, great, this fits, right? So we never know what we're going to get from the public. So we want to keep that open. But as we go forward, the biggest question that we are struggling with right now, where I'm not able to answer your question properly, is there will be a point 10 years down the line when our biggest problem will be space, physical space. And I don't want to dwell on this too much because now we're starting to talk about the form of information, rather, the medium in which, so we're going from stone tablet to, zeros and ones on a hard drive. So we're just changing the form, but the information is what. So I think volumetric sort of decisions is what we'll start to make in the future. So we may say no to something because it's too large. But I think a broad thematic focus allows, in India in this time, in this particular space, when people have so much at home and don't realize that what they have at home is worthy of an archive. Because we all have archives at home. So we just want to keep it broad so that people realize they can donate something. We have to build trust. And maybe in the future we'll start to narrow the focus because people maybe will start to maintain their own community archives. This has started to happen in many parts of the world, right? And so if that happens, then we can narrow our focus. But now let's just open it up as much as we can, see what comes. That's, I don't know.
I was also thinking like archiving is a sensibility in some ways, right? So that when a space for something exists, then you start thinking about things that could be preserved in that space in some ways. So, just this effort to actually start an archive at NCBS, do you see it reflected in other researchers at NCBS suddenly thinking about their work in that manner? Because I mean, we do some policy work at IIHS, and there have been talks about writing papers about how we took those policy decisions because they're equally important, and so has that sort of translated at NCBS?
That's what we would like to see, but perhaps it's too early. I mean, I should not hope for too much so quickly. I think it will probably take a generation. I mean, I'm sort of mentally prepared that it will probably take a generation for this to get into the workflow of an institution. Mary Clark, I think is the name of the writer who studied cults very famously. Looked at I forgot the name of the book. Looking at the history of institutions, she described institutions as being just large characters, just move very slowly. They have a certain character associated. It's very hard to describe. So I think, especially in the space of institutions, getting to a point where the entire institution gets into this thing like saying, yes, what I do matters, process matters, let's do this. Science has its way. Experimental groups have their way of keeping their records. There are various scientists who have said, please preserve your records. There's a famous scientist named Sidney Brenner who wrote a large comment in, I think, Nature magazine a few years ago saying, always preserve your records. It was just a call out to the community. But no, not yet. I don't think so. But 9 months, man. Give us, maybe a few years at least.
No, you yes, that's fine. Thanks, Venkat. Amazing talk. I just wanted to ask, you spoke about the Big A archive. You kind of referred to it a couple of times. In a way, implicit in some of what you're saying, are you making an argument for a small A archive or a reimagination? And, you're not saying it in as many words, but I'd just like to hear more on what you think about that. Yeah.
Or a reimagination of the Big A archive. That, through the process of many small archives. A small archive is responding to a gap in the society, right? The material of a partition archive, in theory, should fit in the National Archives, in theory. But the National Archives has a certain scope to it. It collects government records, it has a way in which it structures, it's looking at the records of the Ministry of X, Ministry of Y. And there are oral history interviews that were done by individuals that, will never feature in that space. So I think it's useful to, which gets you a question of scope of the archives, that, in some sense we want to modulate it to a point where the Big A archives are more attentive to the histories that get lost, and the smaller archives start to become more, hefty and become a Big A archive. That, these community archives are spaces that are valuable as research spaces. That, we have these projects, like the Archives of Scholarship slide that I had talked about, you have something like the Shakespeare Archive. And these are interpretations, these are collection efforts. Or the People's Archive of Rural India, an extraordinary effort where they have a space for resources. And hopefully there will be some bridging between these spaces. So I'm not saying that focus on the small, I'm just saying that both of them need to respond to this. And also keeping in mind our very understanding of the physical structure of an archive will also change over time. We had an architect who reached out to us recently saying she just wanted to spend a couple of weeks with us in the archive just to see what it's like. So I'm trying to force her to work on a project, but I don't think she's going to do it. But if anybody here wants to work on it, to think about what storage in the year 2100 looks like. If we're so focused on the idea of, we think of archives as spaces for files, folders, cabinets and things, let's think about the physical form of an archive. Because we cannot do away with the physicality of an archive. whether it's paper or whether it's a digital server, whatever it is, there is something physical about it. So, sorry, this is a digression, but I suppose it has some connection to the idea of what a big A archive looks like versus a small A, which is someone's cabinet at their desk.
Yeah, hi, thank you for this. And I actually was interested about some of your insights because that you've had in this experience so far, because this archive is on biology, right? So now in some senses you would have had some findings about the kind of gender dynamics or the community caste dynamics of this discipline in India. So if you've had any reflections so far, like how does that even come up? Like is that very visible?
It's exactly like what you think it is. Is the short answer.
No, I can get the gender one, but
yeah.
even like caste and
community. It's super Brahminical. I'm standing here as evidence. But, sorry, I didn't mean to put myself in this story here. But it is very much so. Science is hierarchical. An archive can, of course, offer evidence to that. Now I'm taking off my hat as an archivist and I'm speaking now as a storyteller. So we have a space for stories in the archive where we've looked at some of these questions. So I don't even know where it's somewhere way back in these slides. Yeah. So there's a button called stories. And so we've had a section where, biology historically has done better than the other sciences in terms of parity in gender, or people who identify as women. Now, and of course, this has been long established that in biology in general, there are more women than men through college and through PhD, and then there is a massive sort of change. And these have been widely, described, acknowledged, and there are institutions that are trying to work towards it. I would say that at NCBS, the numbers are perhaps slightly better than many other institutions. I did a count one day. I think the faculty, maybe around 35 to 40% are women. It's not where it should be, but it's better than some in other institutions. But it's a tiny, small institution. It's almost insignificant in the greater scheme of contemporary biology in India. Caste, I don't know what to say. I don't think we're anywhere near that. There are other socioeconomic dynamics to think about. NCBS is within the Department of Atomic Energy, which has its own structures which are very different. So the rules that it has to follow are different from the rules of, say, an MHRD. This gets into the politics of the state. So the Department of Space and Department of Atomic Energy have different rules than the other, because these report directly to the Prime Minister's office. There are entire sort of questions around that. So field of study for someone.
Like a very niche job. How did you get there and what was the process like? And secondly, how did the institution think of setting? Like, what was the trigger? Why would an institution like NCBS think of setting up an archive?
I'll answer the second one first. NCBS has had an idea for an archive for very, very long. The earliest documents that I've seen are from the late 90s, barely 10 years after it was formed, which is interesting in and of itself. I've spoken to a few people, I haven't gotten a good answer around this. Janaki Nair, I think, whom many of you know, has been very deeply involved with this question from the early days. So there has been an idea for setting up an institutional archive to collect documents around the history of the institution. So that has been there. The focus around setting it up as a thematic archive, as we just briefly described, that came more recently. So that's how, at least I hope I answered the second question. My personal journey is just very circumstantial and accidental. I'm trained as a scientist, interested in the peripheries of science, or peripheries of stories, as Joan Didion said in one of her articles. And so that's what led me to look at, so I took a sabbatical from my research. I went into a science writing program, started writing about the sciences, got interested in the histories of science. Through that, got interested in the archives, got lucky to enter an archive where they gave me some material to use, and I started doing interviews. So just a combination of these things. I was doing my research, I was writing about other fields at night, and I was doing these interviews with people during lunch. So there were these three things that were going on for a year or so, and this happened about a decade ago, and that's when this process started. But honestly, my education as an archivist, if I can call myself that at this point, has been purely because of the generosity of all these people and the institutions who've just been very, very kind in sharing knowledge. This is not like the sciences, man. I mean, there's this archiving community that we've reached out to. They've just been so generous with sharing everything that they know. The San Francisco Public Library sent us a box of conservation material. Right, when we ask them, what do we do, and they send video clips and an entire box, here's a starter kit for you to start a conservation lab. Does not happen in the sciences. So it's really, the process has been just constantly learning. I have a training manual of sorts, which I have just looked at other curriculum and developed, and then I foist it upon everyone who comes and works in the archive. Nobody reads it, but I still foist it, hoping that they'll eventually read it. So it's just a constant learning process. I don't have a straight answer. Please go ahead.
I really enjoyed your talk. I mean, I started my career as a botanist, so it's so nice to see an archive of contemporary biology. But coming to the question that I had as you were talking about the forms that are there in the archive, just because it's about biology, do you have any biological material? Because typically, I imagine a botanist, for example, having herbaria, that used to be our training, how you deal with plants, how you press them, how you keep them, and that also really shapes what you do with them. So, I mean, just that, do you have any biological material? If yes, what kind? If no, why not?
As a general rule, we will keep things if it relates to context and process. So, we go back to that statement, archives eliminate context and process. There is a collections facility at NCBS, which would keep, specimens and species. So they have moths and butterflies. They recently got some material related to tigers. There's a herbarium at the French Institute. We haven't received anything like that. We do have a collection of cone snails and shells, mollusk shells, which we received through the work of a scientist named K.S. Krishnan. The only reason we are keeping it, however, is because we have related material, around, where did they go on the field site, the annotated maps where they met someone, the time they met this person. So there is a story. So what I'm getting at here, of course, is that the first two things that I said, archives enable diverse stories, archives eliminate context and process. So we are constantly looking to see what is the largest story. So we're not going to keep a specimen for the sake of keeping that. We'll always be looking for what is the context of this. We would love to keep something close to a herbarium. But we would, yeah.
Like when you go to the field, you'll have pressed flowers that you keep because of certain reasons. And they also tell the journey of a biologist in the field, So those kinds of things, they could also be part of the story that you're trying to tell. So that's why.
I mean, we'd be very open to it, but so this is at least the framework that we want to apply as we get material, because we're very, very conscious of precedent, that once we do it, then we have to keep doing it for a lot of other things. So we have to constantly ask ourselves, why are we keeping this? So we made an exception for those shells only because of the context around which we had the material. And it's kept in the archive as more of a museum piece rather than archival resource. However, you never know how people use it. So there was a fourth year engineering, I think industrial design student who started using that to study the mechanics of shells. So she was interested in understanding how these are made, and so she's an artist and as a designer, so she worked on. So that was great. So she came and worked and spent time in the archives, using the material. So if that happens, great. But that's not a very common way in which the material might get used. We keep custom-built equipment, scientific equipment. So we're looking for that, but it has to be small. We can't fit large things. Yeah. The French Institute has an extraordinary herbarium, and they have really nice stories around the material they've collected. So that's a great space. That's the other thing. I mean, getting to the point of the scope question that you asked. So we might just direct them there. We can all work together. There's no reason for one archive to keep this material. So, yeah.
Hi. Something about what you said just now about, the difference between, I was just reflecting on what could be the difference between a museum sort of curation which is also a way of sort of, archiving or like preserving certain elements of, or preserving certain documents or things about one specific theme versus my training is in architecture, so like even when I think about spaces that you curate or spaces that you design to sort of showcase and sort of archive and sort of display certain kind of things within a sort of a theme versus an archive, and I'm drawing a blank on like how, because maybe it's not very sort of documented before, or like we have not in design school we're not usually like thought, okay, how would you design a space for an archive? So I'm just wondering if you would be able to elaborate what would be a difference between, in your process also, between an archive, a museum. For example, right now C.V. Raman Institute is looking at a museum of, or they're sort of archiving Raman, all the work that they're doing there, and there's a sort of process that they're also following. So it's a good sort of parallel that I can draw from what you presented here also today, and it's sort of very interesting, but I'm just, reflecting.
Just so if I understand your question, you're asking, how does the physical space of a museum differ from the physical space of an archive?
Also the process that drives it, more like?
Right. So I'm not very qualified to speak on museums. I visit those spaces more as, as a tourist, as a visitor. Not that I'm qualified to speak of archives. But for me, the world of the archives is about this, again, going back to context and process. It has to be a space that lends itself to research. It's a space that lends itself to interpretation, where you can go and find newer stories to develop. An archive may very often have a museum space, sort of a front office, which is an exhibiting space. I think of museums having a front office, which is sort of an exhibition space, narrative space, and a back office that will be a collection or an archive. Most museums will have this. So there is an interlink between these four worlds: the galleries, the libraries, the archives, and the museums, which is why there's a lot of conversation on the web around the glam industry. There's no glamour in this, so that's why we call it the glam industry. So the physical structure, I think, I have to go back to this statement of archives as commons. That I think it's useful. I mean, a museum has always been thought of as commons, as a space that the public come to. And the archives has never been thought in that way. It has always been a forbidding space. It has been a space where you're denied entry and you have to make an effort to enter. And I think that framework has to change. So the architecture of an archive, incidentally both words have the same etymology, has to change. I don't know enough about museums to tell you a more sort of thorough answer of what a museum is, but this is how I think of these spaces. I mean, I'm also open it, if others here can chime in, that'll be great.
The answer lies in the etymology again. Museum is a place to inspire.
Okay, to muse, okay. Yeah. Thank you, that's a good point.
Thank you so much, Venkat.
Thanks for coming back.
Thank you all for joining us.